The envelope my son handed me that Wednesday afternoon wasn't a letter, and it certainly wasn't an expression of gratitude or familial warmth. It was an invoice, cold and clinical, with neat bullet points outlining my new status in their household. $600 per month to continue sleeping in their basement, to keep folding his children's laundry, to remain in the space I had foolishly believed was offered out of love rather than convenience. There was no preamble, no gentle conversation leading up to this moment of revelation, just a manila folder thrust into my hands on the staircase, halfway between the basement where I'd been relegated and the kitchen where I'd been preparing his favorite meal, and a price tag affixed to what I had naively assumed was an act of maternal devotion. My name is Gloria Reyes, and I am 63 years old. The story I'm about to share with you isn't one of dramatic confrontation or fiery revenge, though I suppose some might interpret it that way. It's a story about the moment you realize that the person you raised, the child you sacrificed for, the son you believed needed you, has quietly reclassified you from mother to burden, from family to tenant, from unconditional love to conditional transaction. It's about the peculiar kind of grief that comes not from death, but from the slow erasure of your worth in the eyes of those you thought would always see you as irreplaceable. And it's about what happens when you discover that the very thing they tried to take from you was never truly theirs to begin with. Before I tell you how this unfolded, before I describe the choices I made and the consequences that followed, I want you to understand something fundamental about the nature of maternal love and the dangerous assumption that it will always be reciprocated. Because for 3 years and 4 months, I lived in that belief. I gave up my independence, my modest one-bedroom apartment near the bus stop with its drafty windows and peeling paint. Because when Darren called me that autumn evening, his voice threaded with exhaustion, asking if I could help with the twins while he juggled the cafe and Melissa navigated her new remote position, I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. The idea of being needed again, of having a purpose beyond my own solitary existence, lit something inside me that had been dormant since my husband passed 7 years prior. So I packed my life into boxes. My grandmother's cast iron skillet, the wedding photo where Robert and I looked impossibly young, my recipe binder with its grease-stained pages dating back to 1982, and the few books I couldn't bear to leave behind, and I moved into their basement. It wasn't glamorous, this new arrangement. The ceiling hung low enough that I had to duck slightly when moving from one end of the room to the other. The pull-out cot creaked with complaint every time I shifted position during the night. The space heater worked according to its own mysterious schedule, roaring to life at odd hours and falling silent when I needed it most. But none of that mattered because upstairs were Logan and Lily, my grandchildren, with their sticky hands and infectious laughter, and the way they would run to me each morning shouting, "Gamma, Gamma!" with such pure, uncomplicated joy that every sacrifice felt justified, every inconvenience worthwhile. I told myself that this was what family meant, not comfort, not convenience, but connection, not luxury, but love. I was contributing. I was needed. I mattered. My mornings began at 6, sometimes earlier if one of the twins woke crying from a nightmare or teething pain. I would climb the narrow stairs from the basement, my knees protesting slightly more with each passing month, and begin the daily choreography of care that had become my purpose. Heart-shaped pancakes for Logan, who refused to eat anything that didn't look fun according to his very specific 3-year-old aesthetic standards. Scrambled eggs with cheese for Lily, cut into tiny pieces and cooled to exactly the right temperature. I did the laundry that somehow multiplied overnight despite there being only 4 people in the household. I cleaned the bathroom that no one else would touch, scrubbing grout and wiping mirrors and replacing toilet paper rolls with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been performing such tasks for decades. I ran errands while Melissa worked from the dining room table, her laptop open and her phone pressed to her ear, conducting meetings in a low, professional voice that never seemed to include gratitude for the fact that I was the reason she could work uninterrupted. One weekend, I even reorganized the cafe's inventory system, spending hours in the back storage room labeling boxes and creating a spreadsheet system that made sense because I remembered how to do such things from my nursing days when precision and organization meant the difference between efficiency and chaos. No one asked me to undertake this project. I simply saw that it needed doing, and I wanted to contribute in whatever way I could. That's what family does, isn't it? We see a need and we fill it. We don't keep score. We don't measure our worth in transactions. We give because giving is the language of love we were raised to speak. Darren would hug me sometimes when he arrived home late from closing the cafe, quick embraces that smelled of coffee grounds and exhaustion, and I would tell myself that these moments meant something, that I was part of the team, that my presence mattered beyond the practical services I provided. At night, alone in the basement with my tea growing cold on the makeshift nightstand, I would scroll through old photos on my tablet. Darren as a baby in a yellow jumper, gap-toothed and grinning, his first soccer game where he scored an accidental goal and looked so shocked by his own success. The absurdly oversized prom tuxedo he wore at 17, trying so hard to look grown up and succeeding only in looking endearingly awkward. I would study these images and smile, believing I had made the right choice, that this temporary inconvenience was a small price to pay for proximity to the family I had created and raised and loved with every fiber of my being. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in like cold air under a poorly sealed door, instances when I felt invisible during dinner conversations, when Melissa would speak over me mid-sentence as if my words held no weight, as if my opinions were merely background noise to be politely ignored. Times when I would hear them laughing upstairs while I sat alone in the basement, wondering if I was truly part of their lives or simply a convenient solution to their childcare challenges. But I brushed these moments aside, scolded myself for being sensitive, reminded myself that I wasn't here for luxury or validation. I was here for love. I was here for family. I was here because being needed, even in this diminished capacity, was better than being alone. For 3 years and 4 months, I lived in this narrative. I convinced myself it was true. And then came that Wednesday, the day everything shifted, though perhaps shifted is too gentle a word for what actually occurred. Perhaps shattered would be more accurate, or revealed, because nothing actually changed that day except my understanding of what had always been true. It happened in the afternoon, a gray Seattle day with rain threatening but not yet falling, the kind of weather that makes everything feel slightly muted and uncertain. I had just finished folding what seemed like an endless mountain of baby clothes, tiny shirts, and impossibly small socks that I matched with the kind of meditative patience that comes from decades of practice. I was heading upstairs to begin dinner preparations, planning to make baked ziti because it was Darren's favorite, the dish he used to request every year on his birthday when he was young, back when his requests were simple and his love felt unconditional. He met me on the stairs, halfway between my world and his, holding a manila envelope with the kind of serious expression that immediately set my internal alarm bells ringing. There was no smile, no casual greeting, no warmth in his eyes, just the envelope extended toward me and 4 words that changed everything. We need to talk. I took the envelope with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, though I didn't yet know why. I opened it slowly, carefully, as if the speed of revelation might somehow change its contents. Inside was a printed document, professionally formatted with neat bullet points and legal-sounding language that seemed designed to create distance between the writer and the subject. Rent agreement, read the header. $600 per month, due on the 1st of each month. Late fee of $50 will be assessed after 5 days. I blinked, reading the words again, certain I must have misunderstood, that this must be some kind of mistake, or perhaps a document meant for someone else that had accidentally been placed in an envelope with my name on it. Is this... I couldn't finish the question. My voice had become small and uncertain, the voice of a child rather than a mother, and I hated how it sounded, how diminished I had become in the space of a single breath. Darren didn't flinch. His expression remained neutral, almost businesslike, as if we were discussing a matter of pure logistics rather than the fundamental nature of our relationship. "It's just to help cover expenses, Mom," he said, and even the word "mom" sounded different now, perfunctory rather than affectionate. "You've been living here for a while. We're stretched thin financially. This is just fair." Before I could process this, before I could formulate any kind of response, Melissa appeared behind him at the top of the stairs, arms crossed over her chest in a posture of defensive certainty, eyes meeting mine with something that looked disturbingly like contempt. "We pay the mortgage, Gloria," she said, using my first name in a way that felt like a deliberate act of distancing. "We pay the utilities. We buy the groceries. You live here for free, and that's not sustainable anymore. We need everyone to contribute financially." The words landed with the force of physical blows, not because of their content necessarily, but because of what they revealed about how I was perceived, how I had been categorized in their mental accounting system, not as family, not as grandmother, not as the woman who had given up her independence to support them, but as a freeloader, a burden, an expense that needed to be justified and managed and, apparently, monetized. "I help with the children," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "I cook the meals, I clean the house, I do the laundry, I run your errands. I reorganized your entire Café inventory system. I've been here every single day for 3 years, taking care of everything so you two could work and build your lives and—" Melissa cut me off with a sharp gesture, her voice taking on an edge that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation, had perhaps even rehearsed her part. "That's not the same as money, Gloria. We need cash, not casseroles. Childcare and housework don't pay our mortgage. If you want to stay, you need to contribute financially, or you need to make other arrangements." That night, I lay awake in the basement staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles that I had looked at every night for over 3 years, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. I'd left my own life, modest though it was, to help them. I had given up my independence, my space, my rhythm, my autonomy, all the small freedoms that come with living alone and answering to no one. And now I was being told that none of that had value, that I was a burden with a price tag, that my worth could be calculated on a spreadsheet and found wanting. Around midnight, I heard them talking upstairs in the kitchen. They didn't know I was awake, didn't know that sound carried through the old house in ways they had never bothered to consider. Melissa's voice came first, clear and certain. "She's not going to pay it. She doesn't have that kind of money." A pause. Then Darren's voice, quieter but equally cold. "Just give her the deadline. She'll leave eventually. I'm not running a charity here." I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs listening to my son discuss my departure as if I were a problematic tenant rather than his mother, and something inside me that had been bending for 3 years finally broke, not with sound or drama, but with a strange, clarifying calm that felt almost like relief, because suddenly I understood. I had been seeing our relationship through a lens of maternal obligation and familial love, but they had been viewing it through an entirely different framework, one of transaction and inconvenience and calculation. I had been a grandmother and a helper and a member of the family. They had been employers who had gotten 3 years of unpaid labor and were now attempting to convert it into a revenue stream. I packed before sunrise, moving with quiet efficiency through the basement space that had never quite felt like home. 1 suitcase, no note, no tearful confrontation, no dramatic announcement. Just the soft click of a door closing and the realization that I had been downgraded from mother to tenant, and I refused to accept either designation any longer. Before I continue with what happened next, I need to pause for a moment. If you've ever given everything to family only to discover they saw it as transaction rather than love, If you've ever been made to feel like a burden for offering help that was requested, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. What city? What country? And have you ever had to choose between your dignity and your family's demands? Because what comes next in this story is about reclaiming something I didn't even know I still had the right to claim. The motel room smelled of industrial cleaning products and decades of transient existence, that particular combination of bleach and stale air and other people's cigarette smoke that no amount of ventilation can quite erase. The windows didn't open properly, stuck in their frames from years of paint and neglect, and the curtains hung with permanent wrinkles as if they had given up trying to maintain appearances long ago. I sat on the edge of the mattress, springs creaking beneath me, holding that rent contract in my hands as if it were a letter of formal exile from the only family I had left. It had been 3 days since I walked out of Darren's house, 3 days since I closed that door behind me and drove to this place with its flickering neon sign advertising hourly and weekly rates. 3 days, and not a single phone call. Not a text message asking if I had somewhere safe to stay. Not even a perfunctory inquiry about my well-being. I had lived in their house for over 3 years, raised those children with the same devotion I had given to raising Darren. Changed diapers and kissed scraped knees and cut the crusts off sandwiches because that's what Logan preferred, given them my time and my energy and my unconditional presence. And now, apparently, I was no one. Less than no one. A problem that had solved itself by leaving. I looked around the motel room, taking inventory of my new reality. 1 suitcase, 2 pairs of pants, a cardigan with a hole in the elbow that I kept meaning to mend but never quite got around to fixing. That's all I had taken with me, not because I didn't own more possessions, but because in that moment of packing, I genuinely didn't know what was still mine and what had been absorbed into their household. What belonged to Gloria, the individual, and what belonged to Gloria, the unpaid domestic worker. I tried to eat that evening, heating a can of soup in the room's tiny microwave that barely worked, but it tasted like cardboard and regret. I missed my own spices, my own kitchen, my place at their dinner table, even if that place had always been slightly subordinate, slightly conditional. I lay down on the bed with its sheets that felt stiff and impersonal, like hospital linens, and my fingers reached for my phone out of habit, that automatic gesture we make when we're lonely or uncertain or hoping for connection. Maybe someone would check in. Maybe Darren would have a moment of realization. Maybe the children would ask where Gamma had gone and why she wasn't there to make heart-shaped pancakes anymore. Nothing. Just the blue glow of the screen showing no new messages, no missed calls, just the hollow confirmation that my absence had been noted and accepted without apparent concern. I stared at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when I had stopped being part of the family and become part of the furniture, interchangeable and unremarkable and easily replaced. Because that's what I was, wasn't I? Furniture. A functional object that served a purpose until it didn't, until maintaining it became more expensive than the convenience it provided. It wasn't just about being asked to pay rent, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the look on Melissa's face when she said, "Casseroles don't pay the mortgage," as if every meal I had prepared, every load of laundry I had folded, every hour I had spent caring for their children while they built their careers was worth nothing. Less than nothing. A burden they had tolerated out of convenience rather than love. The next morning, I pulled out the old accordion file folder I kept with important documents, the kind of folder you accumulate over decades of being a responsible adult. Birth certificate, social security card, nursing license, hospital employment records from the years before I retired. I wasn't sure why I opened it. Perhaps I just needed to confirm that I existed on paper, that I was a real person with documentation and history, and a life that preceded this moment of abandonment. My hands moved through the papers almost automatically, and then they paused. Tucked between pages I hadn't touched in years was a single envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, with handwriting I recognized immediately. Mrs. Eleanor Langford, my last client before I retired from private nursing. I had sat with her through her final months, spoon-fed her when she could no longer hold utensils, listened to her stories about her youth and her regrets, and her small triumphs when no one else had time or patience to hear them. She had once looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "You're more than staff, Gloria. You're family, the real kind." At the time, I had smiled and squeezed her hand and thought it was simply the sentiment of a lonely woman who was grateful for companionship. I hadn't realized those words were about to change everything. I sat at the motel room's small desk, sunlight struggling through the heavy curtains to cast weak patterns across the worn carpet, and opened Mrs. Langford's envelope with trembling fingers. Perhaps it would just be another thank you card, another expression of gratitude that would make me feel momentarily valued before the reality of my situation reasserted itself. But as I unfolded the letter and the documents tucked inside, I realized this was something else entirely. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant and firm even in those final months when her body was failing, but her mind remained sharp. "You were more than a nurse, Gloria. You were my sanity, my companion, my friend in a way that transcended any professional obligation. I want to make sure you're remembered for that, not with words, but with security." Attached to the letter was a legal document, properly stamped and notarized, dated 5 years prior. I scanned the text once, then again, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were clearly seeing. 51% ownership stake in Sunlight Roasters, LLC, transferred to Gloria Marie Reyes as compensation for services rendered and in recognition of her instrumental role in facilitating this investment. Sunlight Roasters. I knew that name. Of course I knew that name. It was Darren's Café, the business he had built from nothing, the dream he had nurtured and grown and poured all his energy into creating. But as I read through the attached operating agreement and investment documentation, I began to understand what had actually happened, what I had forgotten or perhaps never fully comprehended in the first place. 5 years ago, Darren had needed funding to launch the cafe. He had a vision and passion and work ethic, but he lacked capital. I had introduced him to Mrs. Langford, one of my nursing clients at the time, knowing she had resources and an interest in supporting small businesses. They had met once, a cordial conversation over tea where he pitched his concept, and she listened with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest. She had liked him well enough, commented on his enthusiasm and dedication. But after he left, she had turned to me and said something I had dismissed at the time as the rambling of an elderly woman. "I trust you more than I trust enthusiastic young men with dreams, Gloria. If I do this, I'm doing it through you." And apparently, she had done exactly that. The investment had been made in my name, legally and properly documented, making me the majority stakeholder in a business I had never thought of as mine. Darren knew that Mrs. Langford had provided funding. What he didn't know, what I hadn't known until this moment, was that the investment had been structured to protect me, to ensure that I would always have something that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be devalued, couldn't be reduced to a line item on someone else's expense sheet. I sat back in the creaking desk chair, stunned into absolute stillness. The cafe that my son had built, the business I had helped him secure funding for without asking for anything in return, except perhaps his gratitude and love, wasn't just his. It was legally, officially, predominantly mine, and he had no idea. That afternoon, I left the motel room for the first time since checking in. I drove to a small co-working space downtown and paid $10 to use their printer, scanner, and internet connection. I made copies of everything: the original investment documents, the operating agreement, the transfer of ownership papers. I sent one complete set to a lawyer I found through a quick online search, requesting a consultation to verify the legitimacy and current standing of these documents. I sent another set to a financial advisor, asking for an assessment of the business's current value and my rights as majority stakeholder. Then I made one final call, dialing the number listed on the faded "For Sale" sign I had noticed outside the building that housed Darren's Café during one of my many trips running errands for him over the past 3 years. The property management company answered on the third ring, and I asked in my most professional voice whether the commercial space was still available for purchase. The man on the other end confirmed that, yes, the landlord was looking to sell. Cash offers would be given priority, and would I like to schedule a viewing? I told him I would get back to him shortly, ended the call, and stood by the window of that dusty co-working space, my heart pounding, not with anger or vindictiveness, but with something that felt strangely like purpose. They had tried to erase me from their lives, to reduce me to a transaction that no longer made financial sense. They had valued me at $600 per month and found me not worth even that price. But they had forgotten something crucial. I had never signed myself out of the business I had helped create. I had never relinquished the ownership that a kind, clear-eyed old woman had ensured I would always possess. They saw me as someone with nothing, someone who could be dismissed and discarded without consequence. They were about to discover how wrong they were. 2 weeks passed before the "For Sale" sign outside Darren's Café came down, replaced by a "Sold" placard that drew no particular attention from anyone except perhaps my son, who must have noticed and wondered who had purchased the building he'd been renting for 5 years. The paperwork had cleared with surprising efficiency, the wire transfer had posted, and I now owned not just the majority stake in the business itself, but also the physical space in which it operated. I didn't tell him immediately. That might seem cruel to some, but I prefer to think of it as strategic, or perhaps simply self-protective. Instead, I sat in my new studio apartment, a modest but clean space I had rented above a florist shop where the scent of roses and lilies drifted up through the floorboards, and I waited, watched. Let the silence between us grow deeper and more complex. Let him wonder where I had gone and why I hadn't reached out. Let him experience perhaps a fraction of the abandonment I had felt sitting in that basement, hearing him describe my eventual departure as inevitable. I knew the rent increase would arrive soon. I had instructed the property manager to implement a modest adjustment at first, nothing dramatic or obviously punitive, just enough to create financial pressure, to stir the calm waters of his assumptions about his business and his security. Sure enough, 3 days after the lease renewal notice landed in his mailbox, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Mom, are you involved in this?" I stared at the message for a long moment, watching the 3 dots appear and disappear as he presumably deleted and rewrote his follow-up messages. Then I set my phone down without responding. Silence, I had learned, was often more powerful than any words I could construct. 2 hours later, Melissa called. I watched her name appear on my screen, let it ring through to voicemail, and felt nothing. No guilt, no anxiety, no compulsion to explain or justify or make her feel better about her confusion. Just a calm certainty that I owed them nothing, least of all explanations. Unable to reach me directly, they did what modern people do when they can't control a narrative privately. They took it public. Melissa posted a video on her Instagram account, carefully staged with soft lighting and manufactured tears, talking about how families should support each other unconditionally, how they had opened their home to me in my time of need, and how I had turned on them inexplicably, how I had somehow manipulated the situation to hurt them financially. The comments section filled rapidly, some viewers offering sympathy, others asking pointed questions that Melissa clearly hadn't anticipated. Why would your mother-in-law leave without a word if everything was fine? Did you charge her rent? What exactly did she do to turn on you? I still said nothing. Silence remained my strategy, my shield, my most effective weapon against their attempts to rewrite history in their favor. The cafe's Instagram account began posting increasingly desperate promotions, half-price lattes, limited-time discounts, gift card giveaways, loyalty programs with benefits that seemed designed more to generate immediate cash flow than to build long-term customer relationships. Darren was grasping, trying to compensate for the increased rent and declining sympathy with volume and discounts. I could see the panic in the frequency of the posts, the slight desperation in the captions. That night, I created a simple video of my own. No elaborate production, no dramatic music or filters, no tears or emotional manipulation. Just me, sitting at my small kitchen table with daylight streaming through the window behind me, wearing a simple sweater and speaking in a calm, measured voice that betrayed none of the turmoil this family had caused me. "My name is Gloria Reyes," I began, looking directly into the camera with the kind of steady eye contact that comes from knowing you're telling the truth. "I've been quiet for a while, but I think it's time I speak up, not to attack anyone, but simply to clarify what actually happened." Then I held up the documents, one by one, close enough to the camera that viewers could see they were real, official, properly notarized. The ownership agreement showing my 51% stake in Sunlight Roasters, LLC, the building deed confirming my recent purchase of the commercial property, my investment receipts showing the initial capital that had made the business possible. "I didn't turn on anyone," I continued, my voice remaining even and factual. "I simply reclaimed what I helped build, what was legally mine all along, though I didn't realize it until I was asked to pay $600 per month to continue living in a basement and taking care of my grandchildren without compensation or appreciation. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to tell my side of a story that was being told without my voice." I posted the video without fanfare, without tagging anyone or sending notifications. I simply put it out into the world and returned to my quiet evening, making myself dinner and reading a book, completely unprepared for how quickly truth can spread when it contradicts a carefully constructed narrative. Within hours, the video had been viewed thousands of times. By the next morning, it had been stitched and shared and analyzed by strangers across multiple platforms. A lawyer on TikTok broke down the documents I had shown, confirmed their apparent legitimacy, explained that I had every legal right to both own the business and purchase the building, that there was nothing manipulative or vindictive about reclaiming property that was documentably mine. Melissa attempted a follow-up video, her tone more defensive now, claiming I had ambushed them, that I had somehow hidden this information maliciously, that we could have worked this out as a family if I had just communicated. But the tone in the comments had shifted. Sympathy had curdled into skepticism. People were asking harder questions now, pushing back against her narrative, pointing out the inconsistencies in her story, noting that mothers-in-law don't typically just leave without cause and then suddenly produce legal ownership documents unless something significant had happened to precipitate such actions. I wasn't gloating. I want to be very clear about that. I took no particular pleasure in watching their public image deteriorate or their business struggle. I was simply done. Done being small, done being invisible, done pretending that love without respect or appreciation was enough, done accepting crumbs of affection from people who valued me at $600 per month and decided even that was too high a price. I changed my phone number shortly after the video went viral, gave the doorman at my new building a very specific list of names who were not to be admitted under any circumstances. And for the first time in years, I went grocery shopping for myself, buying the foods I actually enjoyed rather than the foods that fit someone else's budget or dietary preferences. I stocked my refrigerator with good cheese and fresh berries and the expensive olive oil I had always wanted, but told myself was too extravagant. I slept without the constant background hum of a baby monitor or the sound of footsteps above my head. I woke up when my body was ready, rather than when small children demanded attention. They had treated me like a tenant, so I became their landlord. Not out of revenge, but out of a simple recognition that roles and relationships need to be acknowledged and respected. that you cannot claim to love someone while simultaneously billing them for the privilege of your presence. I didn't watch their cafe close. I didn't need to witness that particular ending to feel closure. I heard about it secondhand from the florist who owned the shop below my apartment, mentioned in passing while she was trimming tulips and making small talk. That little coffee shop on 3rd Street, you know the one? Closed last week. Shame. They made a decent latte. I just nodded, made a non-committal sound of acknowledgement, and changed the subject to the weather forecast. It had been 2 months since I posted that video, since I finally told my side of the story in my own words, without interruption or dismissal. After that, I logged off social media entirely, changed all my privacy settings, deleted old group chats and family messaging threads, removed myself from the digital spaces where I could be found and contacted and made to explain myself. I didn't need to watch the fallout unfold in real time, but fragments of information found their way to me anyway through mutual acquaintances and well-meaning friends who thought I should know what was happening. Melissa's sponsorship deals with local businesses quietly disappeared, her name removed from partnership announcements and promotional materials. The PTA groups she had been so active in removed her from committee lists. Her offers to organize events met with polite deferrals and vague excuses. Darren's business email went dormant, his LinkedIn profile turned private, the professional network he had been building for years suddenly unavailable for contact. And me? I kept living? I used part of the proceeds from eventually selling the cafe building to establish a small scholarship fund for women over 60 who were raising grandchildren alone, who had sacrificed their retirement and independence to care for family and needed support to rebuild their own lives. I didn't put my name on the fund, just called it Second Bloom, and set it up to run through a community foundation that could manage the applications and disbursements without my direct involvement. I moved to a quiet coastal town 3 hours north of Seattle, where the air smelled of salt and possibility, where the neighbors respected privacy and didn't ask too many personal questions, where I could walk to the beach every morning and watch the waves reshape the sand with patient, persistent rhythm. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before I got married. Just simple watercolors of scenes from my front porch, the waves, the driftwood, the occasional seagull who would land on my railing and stare at me with what appeared to be judgment or perhaps just avian curiosity. I cooked for one, elaborate meals or simple sandwiches according to my own preference and schedule. I shopped when I felt like it, rather than when someone else's pantry ran low. I never had to justify buying the good butter or the expensive coffee or the fresh flowers that I placed on my table just because they made me happy. Every now and then someone would ask, usually over tea at the local cafe or while standing in line at the post office, "Do you have family nearby? Do you ever hear from your son?" And I would smile politely, neither warm nor cold, and say simply, "No." And then, because I had learned that some people needed the explanation to stop asking, I would add, "And that's okay." Because the truth is, I stopped waiting. I'm not sitting by the phone hoping for apologies or understanding or some grand moment of reconciliation where they would finally see what they had lost and beg forgiveness. I had already given enough of myself to people who saw my love as a service to be consumed rather than a gift to be treasured. Now I gave that love to myself, to the life I was building on my own terms, to the peace that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by other people's valuation. The quiet doesn't scare me anymore. It comforts me, wraps around me like a warm blanket on a cold evening. It feels like finally putting down a heavy bag you didn't even realize you'd been carrying for miles and miles, your shoulders straightening, your breathing deepening, your pace slowing to something sustainable and gentle. This wasn't revenge, though I'm sure some people interpreted it that way. This was peace. This was reclamation. This was the slow, deliberate process of remembering that I was a whole person before I became someone's mother, someone's helper, someone's burden. And peace, I've learned, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or dramatic declarations or final confrontational conversations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the sound of ocean waves just outside your window, in the smell of bread baking in your own oven for no one but yourself, in the luxury of empty hours that you get to fill with whatever brings you joy, rather than whatever someone else needs you to do. I didn't lose a family. I found myself. And that, it turns out, was worth more than any relationship that required me to disappear. Have you ever given everything to someone only to be told you owed them more? Have you ever discovered that the love you thought was unconditional came with a price list you never agreed to? I would love to hear what you would have done in Gloria's place. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched something deep in you, resonated with something you've experienced or feared or quietly endured, you won't want to miss what comes next.